Mark Hartzman, your book is so good that I probably would have contacted you at some point anyway. But one reason why we're having this conversation tonight is because of a guy who works at SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. I'm not even going to use his name because I don't think it would do him any good to be in contact with someone of my ilk. Given that SETI is not all that, it has not been all that forthcoming with UFO researchers that will have a very high opinion about UFO research. In my opinion, SETI and what it does and UFO research and what it focuses on are not really mutually exclusive. You can look out there and you can look here as well. Give me your take on SETI and the work that they're doing, because it's been in existence for a long time. They don't have any evidence of ET signals out there, do they?
No, nothing yet. But you're right. There is a common thread between the two groups, if you will, right? This idea that extraterrestrial life exists. SETI believes it would exist far away, somewhere else within the galaxy or one of the many other galaxies. And those who believe, that UFOs might be here, it's just believe that extraterrestrial life may have actually traversed that distance and gotten here. So it's just a difference of that kind of opinion. But SETI likes, what they'll say is that they barely scratch the surface of the universe in terms of its search for radio waves or some kind of activity that would represent extraterrestrial life somewhere out there. It's just so expansive that with the amount of time it's had and the radio telescopes it's had access to, it's just begun looking. And so that gives hope to the fact that there's still plenty of possibilities that it could detect some kind of radio signal and some actual evidence of another life form out there trying to make contact or just showing evidence. I mean, we've been giving off evidence, since the dawn of television or radio. Even before that, just by living, we've created biosignatures in the Earth's atmosphere. But in terms of sending out radio waves, we've been doing it unintentionally, for nearly a century. So that's already out there. So the question is someone else doing that unintentionally or intentionally? There's still hope to still find something. And they've had a few hits that seem close.
Right.
In the 70s, there was one called the Wow Signal that seemed very unusual. When the scientists saw the figures come in from the data that was plotted, this was at Ohio State Figure Observatory, and it was so unusual. The numbers that came in, basically like 1s, 2s, and 3s were normal activity, and anything above that kind of got into higher numbers and into letters meant something very unusual. And so they had high numbers and a series of letters. So we circled those and wrote "Wow" with the exclamation point, and it became known as the Wow Signal. But they could never replicate it, and they couldn't find anything else that seemed similar or any reason for it. So actually, that's one that kind of remains a little bit unexplained. Most chalk it up to just sort of an anomaly, but some still believe that maybe that was evidence of some sort of signal. But yeah, I mean, SETI's still looking, and I think it's interesting what they're doing, and they've got, they've been funded well to continue the search. But yeah, they tend not to believe that anything has gotten this far. Basically, they believe that life may exist, but we're just too far away from anything, too many light years for something to have traveled that distance.
I had a reason to visit SETI recently within the last couple of months, and I was really surprised by a couple of things. One, how big that operation is. It's not just 1 or 2 or 10 people working. If you look at the photo album that shows all the people who work there, it's a lot of people. 2, I was really impressed by the person we're talking about. And again, I don't want to use his name or getting him any heat, but he was actually open to some of the more exotic possibilities that there could be life here already, and we just don't even recognize it. If it was 1 million or 10 million years older than us, he was open to that possibility. And I suspect there are other people at SETI that have entertained an interest in the coverage of UFOs and what's going on in the world right now. I don't know if you've been there, but there's a life-size cutout of Frank Drake, who created the Drake equation, and on the wall behind this cutout in neon is the Drake equation. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, I need one of those for my house. It's really awesome. But what do you think about the Drake equation now that we've got more than, say, 5,000 exoplanets discovered? Does the equation change now that we know for sure there are worlds out there, some of them in the Goldilocks zone, that could be a place where life as we know it could evolve?
Well, it certainly seems that way. I love that possibility. The Drake equation, for listeners who might not be familiar, that was created in 1961 by Frank Drake. Basically, he created all these terms of the equation as a way to have a conversation for a gathering of various scientists, which included young Carl Sagan at the time. And they took these variables to try to understand what the possibility for the existence of intelligent extraterrestrial life might be within the galaxy. And so that was based a little bit on some numbers that they could be certain about, like the rate of star formation. But the rest of it was based on really conjecture. How many, if there was a star, how many planets might there be around it? Like you said, in the Goldilocks zone, how many of those planets could support life? If they support life, did it become intelligent life? If it became intelligent life, did it develop enough to learn how to reach out to other life and communicate with other forms of life? And did that civilization last? How long would it have lasted to further those pursuits? And so the number they came up with was a pretty big range. At the end of the day, they estimated, if I remember correctly, I believe between 10,000 and 100 million intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations in the galaxy. So that's a lot of hope. That's a lot of space. At the same time, Drake didn't believe any of those civilizations could reach Earth, again, based on the distance. He thought the distance was just too great to overcome. So then now, knowing that we have these more than 5,000 exoplanets, and they're consistently discovering more of them, it just raises the question and the possibility even more. Like, okay, it seems like there is room for more life. What's interesting is that our mutual friend you mentioned, Seti, he discusses, and I talked about this in We Are Not Alone, that maybe the Drake equation, the answer is actually more like one, being us. And he talks about different reasons, which I thought were really interesting. And just before I get into that, he is open-minded to the idea that there could be life in other galaxies, and maybe there are things we still don't know. So, not saying that this is absolute, but his theory is interesting, just kind of gets into ideas that I think most people don't really think about when we think about life existing elsewhere in the galaxy. One example of that is that there are things called gamma ray bursts that happen more in the center of the galaxy. And if one of those hits an exoplanet, it would wipe out all life on it pretty much instantaneously. It's like taking all the power of our sun, of the course of the life of our sun, and having that power just hit within 24 hours over anything that's in its path. So that would wipe away any developing life. And that happens, often enough that it would start to decrease those numbers. He also talks about kind of how lucky we are as human beings that we exist, and how much chance there is that we're even where we are now, which is, when you think about it, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, if an asteroid didn't hit the Earth, or a meteorite didn't hit the Earth and wipe out the dinosaurs, and a few mammals didn't hide and survive and evolve into us, we might not be here.
Right.
Who knows?
Yep.
And the fact that we live above land and we can look up at the heavens, and wonder these things is also kind of unique. If you look at other creatures that have intelligence, like dolphins and orcas, they have intelligence, but they're underwater, and they don't have the opportunity to look up at the sky. So just the very nature of our existence is so incredibly unique that he talks about that in terms of maybe we truly are the one unique species in the universe. And if that's true, we really do have a huge responsibility, and maybe life spreads from here. So all interesting thoughts. I love just the way of thinking.
To someone who is a UFO ET proponent, if they were to ask this question, sort of, why don't they land on the White House lawn? What possible explanation could you have for why do we only get these brief glimpses, occasional radar sightings, fuzzy photos? If they're here, why don't they land and show themselves and declare themselves? What could the answer to that be?
This is such a good question. And, there's, I guess, a few answers you could say. One is, why are they coming here in the first place? Are they interested in communicating with us? It would seem not, because then they could have done so, right? If they have the ability to get here, they could certainly have done that if they chose to. So what are they doing here? Are they observing us? Did they create us to begin with, and they're checking in on us and seeing how we're doing? Are they waiting for us to evolve further before establishing communication? Maybe they're coming back periodically to check. These are all really good questions that clearly no one has any answer to. It's all just theory. Are they concerned that we would respond poorly to them, which we probably would?
Yeah.
We're not the most welcoming of species. So it might be more of a safety thing for them that they're just observing. It's hard to say. But yeah, like I said, all just sort of theory at the moment.
One other question before we'll open up the phone lines. For me as a reporter, what hooked me on the topic was the paper trail. There is a string of pretty interesting documents that were written before the Freedom of Information Act was the law of the land. Very candid discussions in between different military organizations and folks behind the scenes in which they discuss UFOs and ETs and this mystery in very candid, frank terms that changed once FOIA became a law, in which they say it's not visionary fictitious, it's real, it's not us. We don't think it's us. It might be from somewhere else. Project Sign was really an active and honest investigation that got quashed. It became Grudge, which became Blue Book, which was largely a public relations exercise. That lack of honest investigation and the fact that behind the scenes, the military and government officials were saying something else than what they were saying to the public is what got me going down this road. And how far down that UFO paper trail rabbit hole did you go?
I definitely went down it. I mean, it's fascinating. There's some great comments, like you said, where they basically are acknowledging that there is a phenomena, and they basically are calling them, UFOs without using that term exactly. But they're basically acknowledging that there's something coming that they can't identify at all. And then, of course, like you said, that kind of starts getting explained away quickly as Project Blue Book evolves, and Grudge especially as well. They really didn't want to acknowledge anything as being a UFO, so find any explanation you possibly can. The Robertson panel kind of helped promote that idea as well in the early 50s, just kind of put together by the CIA looking for ways to understand this problem and then get rid of the problem, really. I mean, Robertson panel basically asked Blue Book to just please explain away everything. We don't want mass hysteria. We don't want panic. And they actually believe that too many UFO reports were distracting the Air Force from its regular duties. And this might actually become an issue that they're looking into too many UFOs, not paying attention to basically Cold War issues. So, I mean, yeah, they were trying to just get rid of it because they didn't want to deal with it. They didn't know what it was. And that's not a way to get answers.
A lot of people think Arrow's doing the same thing. That's a discussion for another time. We're going to take a call before the break. Bill in L.A. Hey, Bill, you're on the air. What's going on?
Hey, George. As a former newspaper writer myself, I'm more skeptical about SETI and government disclosure than I am about UFOs. And I think SETI actually stands for Search for Extra Taxpayer Income. I don't think the guy you're talking about is the guy I've had a couple of run-ins with on your show. But that guy, and I won't mention him, recently wrote a book called Confessions of an Alien Hunter. And it's a phony title because he is not a believer that anything has ever come here. And I've noticed that he and his doppelganger debunker, Adam Frank, are starting to write these trendy books with alien in the title. And I think Frank's is called Little Book of Aliens. And I had a conversation with Adam Frank, a nice guy, about 10 days ago. But he definitely is a debunker, and he claimed that the Tic Tac videos are kind of choppy. And look, there are only 3 of them. And who knows when that F-18 radar was refurbished? I mean, they say outrageous things like this to try to get rid of the data, which is not the scientific method at all. You're supposed to explain the data in terms of a good theory, not just get rid of it. So I have severe doubts about government disclosure. And I want to comment on something Mark said about disclosure. He said, I think a few years ago, the government would not have admitted some things that it admitted recently. And I just want to point out, as a history teacher, that good old Harry Truman came forward in 1950, as we know, on camera and said, hey, the Joint Chiefs and I discuss flying saucers every chance we get. And look what happened after he did that. It's been a nonstop campaign of debunking from every government source since then. So, but the good news is we really don't need the government to believe that there's evidence that we are not alone. So that's the good news.
I have to agree with you, Bill. Mark, I'm sure you want to weigh in on some of that.
Yeah, I agree. it is weird to just throw data away. That's not the idea at all. And the idea is to collect more of it so that you can actually understand what was it that was seen. And that's what I think is interesting. We talked about earlier about with Avi Loeb and the Galileo project is making that effort to actually get the data. On the other hand, in terms of like what the government's doing now, I think what's great about the efforts now, I guess this was, like you said, in the 50s there was that acknowledgement, but it was tried to be pushed away. But to me now there's such an issue of national defense in terms of understanding what it is. And I mean, just looking back this past February with, this was like just when I was in the edits of the book, and I was like, oh, what do I do now when there were 3 UFOs shot down? Like, the headlines were basically, we just shot down the UFO. Like, it was 4 times in a week, which was crazy. And of course, the first one was identified as a Chinese spy balloon, but that just proved the point that we need to be paying attention to what's in the skies, whether it's extraterrestrial or not. There are things flying above that could be hazardous to pilots or to us as humanity. We don't know, but pay attention to it and let's find out what they are.
Yeah, a couple of government people and members of Congress have had the same sort of an observation where they say, we better hope it's aliens and not the Chinese or Russians who have this technology, because if it's an earthly opponent, we're in big trouble. That technology, I don't know how you get around the national security implications, because there is a race to get it, assuming that it's not an Earth origin technology to begin with. Mark, let me ask you this before we go back to the phones. In your book, We Are Not Alone, you talk about the hopes and fears and fantasies. What happens if tomorrow there's an announcement that aliens are real? We don't know exactly why they're here, but it is confirmed by the government that it's real. By tomorrow night, what's the reaction?
That's a really good question. And part of me feels like, one, it should be a completely life-changing moment that changes how we think about everything. And ideally would bring humanity together to try to understand it together and realize that we really are one species and we shouldn't be so much opposition between so many of us around the globe. So that I would hope that would be the response, right? That we would unify and try to understand how to deal with this situation together. What might it mean? What can we be learning from this? So I think that would be the ideal. On the other hand, I can't help but wonder if a majority of people would just take in the news and get right back on with their day and start scrolling back through TikTok and, dealing with more frivolous types of nonsense than something that could, change the way we think about humanity and the universe that we live in. So,
yeah,
that's sort of my pessimistic view of what.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, you look at Congress, and it's like the public in general. The interest is a mile wide and an inch deep. And for Congress, there are people who are really interested in this and committed to getting to the bottom of it right now. But there's always something that comes along that is more pressing. War in Ukraine or aid to Israel or shut the government down or the budget. There's always a higher priority, something more immediate. I suspect, the public reaction would be based on what the announcement is, just saying that, yeah, it's real, it's here. We don't know where they're from, but they haven't annihilated us yet, and people would go back to their business. I mean, we had 3 UFOs shot down in February. One of them was a balloon, but we're not sure what the other ones were, and people paid attention for 2 or 3 days, and then, hey, what's on Netflix tonight,
Exactly. Yeah, no one cared about the answers to the other 3. Those just remain unknown.
Right.
Which is pretty fascinating. Yeah, back to work.
Yeah, I don't have great faith in the ultimate fate of our civilization, I'll tell you that. We're going to go to the international line. Don in Alberta, Canada. What's on your mind, Don?
Hi, George. Hi,
Howdy.
Mark. So back in the middle of August, a friend sent me a picture off of his security camera of an orb in his yard, basically. And I'd seen him before on my trail cams, and I've seen him in the areas that I was at before, but usually they all glow. But about 2 weeks later, I'm standing slightly in the bush, and I catch the corner out of my eye. I see this perfectly white ball. First, I thought it was a balloon, but it was just moving too fast, and it was in a straight direction, and the wind didn't seem to bother it. So it was about 3.5 feet diameter. It was perfectly white. It was doing about 45, 50 miles an hour, or 80K in Canada. and it was just scooting along just above the trees, just along the tree line, because it was open field on one side, bush on the other. But the thing that got me is it got further away. It starts to zigzag back and forth, and I thought, that's really odd. Then 3 days later, you had a gentleman on one of your shows that he had three theories why those white balls, or whatever you want to call them, because they're not nothing we own, why it zigzags back and forth. But my fourth theory would be that when I put my attention on it, it started going back and forth. My second comment on UFOs is in the spring of 1967 up here, a little town called St. Paul, there was a 300-meter craft that came around and hung around for hours, and it went all over the town and outside the town. It was translucent color, super bright. It lit everything up like daylight, and it was a big event. And so for Canada's Centennial, they got money and they built a UFO landing pad.
Huh.
But I was listening to another show about 3 weeks ago, and they had a gentleman on that after he was working at a missile base in 1967, and I think it was March 15th, and because they were all sworn to secrecy, they couldn't talk about it, but his description of the craft was almost identical, but it went around and it shut off all the missiles on the base. But what struck me was the time and the description of the craft, and I was almost wondering if it was the same one. I didn't get the location of which missile base he was working at, but it was the timing that caught me. So, and I don't think we need the government to tell us that there's UFOs, because every day they have to sign off. The gentleman said that if they talked about what they had seen, they would have got time in Leavenworth. So, anyway, there's my two comments. You can comment on either one of them.
Oh. Well, I'd say this. We don't need the government to tell us, because people can see these things for themselves, and individual citizens and scientists can go ahead and study and investigate all they want. The only thing is the government does have probably the best evidence because they have a capability to collect it. They have satellites and radar. They have a worldwide, our government, our military has a worldwide presence and all kinds of sophisticated sensors, and they've collected this kind of stuff for a long time. And whatever these UFOs are, they seem to show an inherent interest in military sites and military equipment, things of that sort. So I think it would help if we could get access to what our government agencies know, because it's got to be a lot better than the data we have in the civilian sector. Mark, thoughts?
Well, yeah, I agree with that. It'd be great to get the data that's been collected. And like you said, they have access to so much more of it than the public sector. And it'll take the public a lot longer to gather that, to then start to find answers. I was kind of intrigued by what you said, though, about a landing pad being built for the sighting that you mentioned. I was actually just reading about Donald Kehoe's plan in his last book in the early 70s called Project Lure, where he was working with other people to basically build a giant lure for UFOs, basically like a whole sort of city, replica of a city that would attract UFOs to come to that spot, and we could then arrange a meeting there. So it's kind of interesting that you just mentioned that a landing pad was built, basically that idea of, can we lure someone here and arrange a type of meeting?
Yeah, that's interesting. There are a couple of projects over the years of people who want to build UFO landing pads. I think some of them have been built. I know the Raelians want to build a UFO embassy to welcome the ETs or something like that. I don't know. I can't recall if that's in your book or not, or whether you encountered the Raelians.
No, I didn't get into the Raelians.
That's your next book. There you go.
Yeah, I'm working on that now.
All right, the wild card line. We got Mark in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hi, Mark. What's on your mind?
I had an encounter with one of these tremendous triangle-shaped UFOs back in October of 1987. And I came home late at night, and I was living out in the middle of nowhere in Lewisburg, North Carolina. And I got this sense that something was weird. Everything was quiet. There were no insects chirping or frogs or anything croaking. And I had this sort of feeling that I should look up. I can't really describe it other than that. And there was a triangle above my head larger than a football field, completely silent at treetop level. with lights on the corner and about 6 lights on the side. And this thing was blacker than the night. I mean, it blotted out the sky. It was darker than the sky. You could see the stars on either side of it, which, helped determine the shape in my eyes. But it just drifted over my head, went to the northeast, and disappeared at treetop level over the tree line. It was just gone. And I've never seen anything before or never seen anything since like it. I don't know how something like that could evade radar of that size. And it certainly didn't obey the physical laws of the Bernoulli principle or anything like that. In addition, it was totally silent. I mean, it was completely quiet. And it just always has been something that I've wondered about. Friends have asked me, well, did you get abducted or do you have any sense of lost time? I really don't. The only strange sensation was the desire that I feel like it instilled to me to look up. I know that sounds strange, but I don't know if anyone else has ever experienced that. But I was just wondering what your guest thought of that encounter, and has he heard similar stories?
Yeah, where did you say you saw this?
This was in Lewisburg, North Carolina, in October of 1987.
Yeah, that's why I thought you said North Carolina. It's interesting because what you're saying sounds very much like my friend Lee Spiegel's sighting in the mid-'70s, which was in Lumberton, North Carolina. And he also saw a giant triangle-shaped UFO that was also described as treetop level high and also silent. And he was with the police chief of Lumberton and I think a few other officers and a few other witnesses. They had heard multiple reports of this object. J. Allen Hynek sent him down to Lumberton to investigate, sent Lee Spiegel to investigate. And they drove around, and finally they saw it themselves, pulled up the side of the road, and saw this thing just hovering above. And Lee said it actually shot down like a beam of light right at his feet. There's a illustration of that in the book. And then it sped off just completely silently, and they chased it down, but they couldn't keep up with it. Another officer reported later that he had also seen it, and it had blinked at him. He flashed his headlights at it a couple times. It blinked back twice, almost like it was mimicking his flashing of his headlights. So like a communication, basically, between the two. And Lee had investigated this. He looked into, checked in with the local Air Force, were pilots testing any kind of new craft, were there test flights at that time, and nothing aligned with the timing or the object that they saw. And so that was one of those cases that went unexplained, and it's unidentified to this day. And Lee, someone I know, shared the story and shared it lots of times on his own programs. And he, I don't see any reason that this guy would have made anything up. And again, he was with the police chief at the time, other witnesses. So it sounds very much like your story. And it's interesting that it was also North Carolina just a little over 10 years after his sighting.
Huh. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that call. First-time caller, Michael in South Carolina. Hi, Michael. Welcome to Coast to Coast. How you doing, and what's on your mind?
Howdy. Love the show. I wish this stuff would come out sooner with the aliens there. Because as far as the government going on about them, because 5 years ago, I know people would have been all up and down this with interest. But it's just that since then, in between the economy and how hard it is getting to live where I'm at, people just have lost, they just lost faith and lost interest in it altogether.
Yeah, you could be right. I mean, there is broad interest, but I don't know how deep it is.
A lot more scattered than it used to be, it appears to me, at least in my area anyways.
Mark, Mark Hartzman, I guess you hope that's not true. You're selling a book.
Yeah, I hope that well, look for widespread interest, and people, I think will find a lot to enjoy in the book.
I think the series of events out of the government, even though some of it has been backtracking of late, the comments from the head of AARO, who's now leaving, have sent conflicting signals to the public, and I don't know if that's on purpose. I suspect it is. It certainly has sent conflicting messages to potential whistleblowers. There are some; they're real, and I'm sure, Mark, you've crossed paths with some of that information. People who've stepped forward, who have met behind closed doors, have given a testimony under oath in some cases, who've been asked to provide information to AARO, and I think I think what I've been told is they're having second thoughts about it, and I can understand why.
Yeah, well, you're putting yourself out there for sure, right? And you're going to have, I think any of those people are going to have their share of believers and their share of detractors, and it's you want to put yourself into that position. But it's interesting hearing the stories that are coming out. And like we said, I think at the beginning, I'm hoping that we see some actual evidence of it soon. I think it would be amazing.
You know, we've seen some amazing capabilities, some of the cases that have been reported, some that have been confirmed by people who worked in the government. There's a quote in your book from Bob Jacobs, and I know the case that he's talking about that he experienced. The quote that you have, basically, I think he says they could wipe us out if they wanted to. They could annihilate us if they wanted to, but they haven't. They have, however, made some pretty dramatic demonstrations of their capabilities if you take some of these cases in government files literally, right?
Yeah, in fact, what you just mentioned, the fact that they haven't annihilated us, going back to the earlier conversation about whether it's foreign adversaries that have created these UAPs that we can't explain, it is a relief that if it is extraterrestrial, that we're still here. So that's a good sign, first of all. Yeah. But yeah, I thought I watched him this was October 2021 at the National Press Club when Bob Jacobs, along with Robert Salas and a few others, were other retired Air Force captains, were talking about their experiences at nuclear sites in the 60s. And they were very, very genuine in their stories and their feelings of passion for what had happened, and being able to share these stories, so many years later, and having had to keep it quiet. But it is pretty fascinating that they had these experiences over these nuclear sites. And Robert Salas's case, this was at Malmstrom in 1967. The UFO appeared over the site, and then 10 ICBMs were taken offline. The same thing had happened about 10 days earlier. Another 10 at a nearby base were also taken offline. And as Captain Salas said, each of those are independent of each other. So it's not like you flip one switch and all 10 go offline. All 10 would have to be turned off individually. And he was explaining that for a glitch to cause one of them to go down would be extremely rare and unlikely. And so for 10 glitches to happen simultaneously, he can't even imagine that could be a possibility. And so this was one of those cases that, again, was never explained, but it does make you wonder if they're showing their capability. Is that something that maybe ultimately keeps us safe? That would be the hope.
Yeah. I mean, it did seem to send a message, hey, this is your most powerful weapon system, but the same thing happened in the 70s on those northern tier cases at the U.S.-Canadian border, and then it happened in the 80s in Russia, where it was the missiles where the launch control codes were entered at a Ukraine ICBM base, and these missiles were ready to go, and the panicked Russians who were working the control system couldn't shut them off. It was a direct demonstration, because for 2 hours over that base, these UFOs have been dancing around. The Russians didn't know what the heck to make of it. So, there have been some pretty dramatic cases that, I don't know, I hope whatever that message was, that our respective governments got it. As you mentioned in your book, there were some pretty interesting quotes that came out of Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev back when they were both in power, about wouldn't it be something if we were threatened by something way out there, we'd all get together and realize we have a lot in common as Earthlings, right?
Yeah, and I love that thought. I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, the idea that maybe that's what finally brings us together, is to take something that drastic. And that is the hope that he would be right. I love that Ronald Reagan brought that up in the 80s in front of the world.
Yeah, 5 times I think he made those statements. Yeah. Mark Hartzman, I really enjoyed the book, We Are Not Alone. There's so much great stuff in there. We didn't even get to talk about Adamski, Van Tassel, Howard Menger, the era of the Space Brothers, and how these beautiful aliens are here to help us and taking flights to Venus, and they all look like movie stars. That'll have to be another time. There's so much good stuff. I hope people will check out your book, and you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you so much, George. I really appreciate it. It's great to hear.
I do too. Good luck with the book. Thanks also to my earlier guest, Dr. Bruce Rapuano, and his book, Dominion Lost. It was a terrific piece of work. And to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Michael Cosio and Donna Walker, Lex Lonehood, Jeremy Wells, Dan Galati and Chris Boros, Lisa Lyon, Tom Danheiser, George Norrie and his team. I'll be back next Sunday night. Good night, everyone.